All right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Emma Thompson, and we have Andrew Bertucci, Kara Hanley, and Dave Morris, who make up our media assessment team for the USS Theodore Roosevelt's COVID-19 response. Next slide, please. I'm going to start with our timeline, which we started on March 5th when the TR had the Vietnam port visit, and our assessment end date is 30 June when the final decision was made to not reinstate Captain Crozier. The overall spikes in media coverage began first from the press conference to the letter being published, then Captain Crozier's firing and Secretary Modly's speech. We see a drop post Modly's resignation, with two more significant spikes, one being the chief's death, and the second, the announcement of the expanded investigation. After that, there are still 2 whole months of media coverage on the TR situation, but primarily we found coverage in May and June to be neutral or aligned. And aligned and not aligned with Navy messaging is actually how our research team decided to define tone in our assessment. Next slide, please. Because of how dynamic this topic turned out to be, we didn't feel as if positive and negative were appropriate classifications. The research team considered the Navy's framing of the issue and measured how many times reporters included Navy messaging. +1 was awarded for each Navy message, -1 for a non-aligned frame or counter message, and we gave facts and neutrals 0. For example, our team classified support for Captain Crozier for his decision-making as a non-aligned frame since it did not express Navy messaging as following the chain of command. Overall, tone of the article was then determined by net points. An aligned news story was characterized as having more Navy messages than counter messages, and a not aligned story would have more counter messages. A neutral article would then have equal messaging or just contain facts. Our unit of analysis was the news article, and our team analyzed 467 of them. We used traditional media sources, including national, international, defense, trade, and wire sources, and we chose those outlets because of their high visibility status and their understanding of defense and Navy issues. This allowed us to observe the presence of Navy messages in articles. Overall, 28% of the articles aligned with Navy messaging, 30% we coded as neutral, and 40% did not align with Navy messaging. Now I'll pass it over to Andrew to talk about prevalence of voice.
During our research, we looked at several prominent voices, with former acting SecNav Thomas Modly dominating the coverage due to multiple press conferences, interviews, and the leaked 1MC remarks on the Theodore Roosevelt. Captain Crozier was a close second following the leak of his memo and, despite never granting any interviews or providing comments to the media. Our team also found out of the 467 articles analyzed, principal voices dominated reporting compared to public affairs voices. The data suggests that principals employed PAOs in more of a management function, vice a technician function, to create opportunities for principals to further the Navy's communication objectives. Next slide. Throughout the Theodore Roosevelt incident, reporters noted President Trump's criticism of military issues in the past, especially on hot issue topics. We analyzed President Trump's voice to see how he impacted reporting and found that President Trump's voice was 53% not aligned with Navy messaging after appearing in 95 articles. Next slide. Throughout our research, former acting SecNav Modly's coverage was analyzed to be 55% not aligned with Navy messaging. As you may expect, the largest increase in non-aligned articles appeared during the relief of Captain Crozier and when Modly resigned. Reporters quoted Modly the most from his leaked 1MC announcement when he said, quote, "Crozier was too naive or too stupid." Next slide. Speaking of Captain Crozier, we found that Crozier's leaked memo was featured 148 times by outlets and was 59% not aligned with Navy messaging. Reporters quoted the captain's letter primarily in reference to the immediacy of his request, concern for the crew, and when discussing the 2 investigations. Next slide. When it came to Navy leaders, they actively engaged with the media throughout the timeline of events, with an overall aligned tone of 39% and 148 articles. The top Navy leader voices present were CNO Admiral Gilday, followed by Admiral Aquilino and Rear Admiral Baker. Next slide, please. For public affairs contribution, the most prominent on-the-record involvement can be credited to OSD's press secretary, as well as the CNO, PAC Fleet, and 7th Fleet PAOs. During our research, we understood the ability for Navy PAOs to provide on-the-record comments and context was probably restricted due to political concerns and the high visibility nature of the ongoing investigation. However, what our team found is when PAOs provided statements, coverage aligned with Navy messaging 44% of the time. And Dave will expand more on this key finding later in the presentation. Next slide. With the Theodore Roosevelt being docked in Guam, we wanted to see how that event played out over time and if there were any strains on the relationship. Governor Guerrero acted as the prominent voice for Guam during the outbreak, and her comments aligned with how the Navy and Guam were working together to treat the Theodore Roosevelt crew. Next slide. With 2020 being an election year, we expected both presidential candidates to weigh in on the Navy's response to the Theodore Roosevelt COVID-19 outbreak. When we compared the tone of articles featuring President Trump and presidential candidate Biden, we found that both of them were not aligned with Navy messaging more than they were aligned. And congressional representatives did not miss out on the chance to weigh in on events either, with Democrats in both chambers calling for a formal investigation into the outbreak and into Crozier's firing. Now I'll pass off to Dave Morris to discuss his unique findings.
Thanks, Andrew. DoD civilian and military leaders were mentioned 436 times in this sample, 12 times more than PAOs. 47% of those mentions were in articles that did not align with Navy messaging. 30% of those mentions were in articles that align with Navy messages. PAOs and spokespersons were only mentioned 34 times in this sample. Of the times PAOs were mentioned, 26% of those articles did not align with Navy messaging, while 44% did align with Navy messaging. Next slide, please. 15% of articles featured an official on background. Articles that had an official provide information on background aligned with Navy messaging 31% of the time, while articles that did not have someone on background align with Navy messaging 28% of the time, suggesting that providing information on background minimally impacted the tone of stories. Next slide, please. Other ships were mentioned in 17% of articles. 44% of those articles that mention other ships were aligned with Navy messages, while 25% did not align. Interestingly enough, 100% of articles mentioning the FS Charles de Gaulle were either aligned with Navy messaging or neutral, despite the ship having a COVID outbreak of its own. Articles that mention the USS Kidd were aligned with Navy messaging 42% of the time, as opposed to general reporting of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, which aligned with Navy messaging only 28% of the time. Next slide, please. Of the top 5 messages present in this analysis, 4 are aligned with Navy messaging, the exception being that Captain Crozier was fired for taking care of his people. I'll now pass it off to Kara to discuss recommendations.
Thanks, Dave. So after this whole entire analysis, we have 4 major recommendations. And a lot of these are going to sound like common sense for public affairs officers, but what we're really trying to do here is give you the data to make recommendations to senior leaders in the future, and that you have this data to back up the recommendations so it's not just your opinion. So our first recommendation, cut the noise. Inform and educate senior leaders to minimize excess noise wherever possible. This is going to allow the Navy messaging to have a free flow to the public through the media, and they're not going to have to force the message as hard through the noise that senior leaders create. I think a lot of our senior leaders have this idea, they fully understand their audiences, they know how to read them, but after analyzing this case, we realized that that might not always be the case, and people can get caught up in an emotional response. Our second recommendation is to prepare now. Despite the novelty that this whole entire pandemic presented, crisis communications is nothing new, and neither is risk management in prevention of something actually getting to become a crisis. We are going to reinforce the proper use of environmental scanning here, as well as understanding audiences and being able to anticipate any issues that may arise and advise our senior leaders about it too. In some cases, it's not enough to say you shouldn't say that, you should say this. We have to go the extra step further and say you really shouldn't be saying anything like this if you fully understand your audience. Our third recommendation is to be realistic about communication tactics. We really wanted that off-the-record data and the on-the-record data to be more emphatic about the hard work that public affairs officers were putting into these conversations. We wanted it to be this drastic increase in how much more aligned the stories were if a public affairs officer was going on background. But when you look at the data, it just wasn't there to support it. This is not to discount any of that, because we understand that building that relationship with reporters and trying to move the needle on a story is critical. But when you look at the straight data here, in this certain event, it just was not the case. However, we did recognize some opportunities here that we want to bring some realism to. We understand through our analysis of Governor Guerrero's participation in public affairs events that anytime you can incorporate a government leader who is on the same page as the Navy into a public affairs effort, that's going to align the story better towards the Navy messaging. So understanding these opportunities and identifying them in the future is a best practice that should be carried forward with a dose of realism. And then finally, minimize delay. This is a DoD principle of information. We understand that we need to maximize information with the minimum delay possible, but this analysis gives us the data to show that, you know, if you look at our timeline in the beginning, there was 2 months where that reporting could have kind of cut off as if we had finalized the investigation and moved forward on the recommendations there. But instead, because of the delay in it, we ended up going 2 more months for a total of 4 months that brought in an increased risk for counter messaging to come about. So this is just something we need to make part of the risk calculus in the future if we're going to be giving advice to our senior leaders on investigations, formal investigations, and how they are to flow. So we understand that this was just a very unique situation, and there's a lot that we couldn't control here, but we do believe that we can control these 4 recommendations as we move forward. So with that, we are now ready to take any questions. I'm going to stop my screen share so I can see the people who are asking me questions.